The hiss of a bottle cap pops in the summer heat. Cold glass sweats against your palm. A spoonful of ice cream, shockingly cold, hits your tongue. You're looking up at a watchtower, a guard silhouetted against the sky. This isn't the story you were told. This isn't the story you expected to live. By 1945, there were over 371,000 German prisoners of war held on American soil. From Aliceville, Alabama to Papago Park, Arizona. From Hearne, Texas to Concordia, Kansas and Algona, Iowa, more than 500 camps dotted the landscape of over 40 states. These men, captured on the battlefields of Europe and North Africa, braced themselves for the worst. Propaganda had promised them starvation, humiliation, and brutal retribution at the hands of their American captors. Instead, they found rules, they found routine, and they found something utterly baffling: the 1929 Geneva Convention, not as a dusty document, but as a daily reality. Red Cross inspections weren't just a formality, they were a fact of life. This meant they were entitled to the same rations as the American soldiers guarding them. It meant access to medical care, the right to send and receive mail, and even pay for their labor a daily wage of 80 cents, issued in Canteen scrip. Imagine the shock. After years of wartime scarcity of gritty black bread and ersatz coffee, you're handed a tray. On it sits soft, pillowy white bread. Real meat, a steaming mug of actual coffee. You walk into the canteen, a small store within the camp, and your scrip can buy you things you'd almost forgotten existed. Soap that lathers, packets of cigarettes, bars of chocolate. And there, nestled in a cooler of ice, is the quintessential symbol of American life, a 5-cent bottle of Coca Cola. For many, the first sip was a revelation. It was a taste of the enemy, a sweet, bubbly contradiction to everything they'd been taught to hate. The propaganda posters back home had depicted Americans as decadent and weak, but this was abundance. This was a nation so rich it could afford to give its prisoners ice cream and soda. The hiss of that bottle cap wasn't just a sound. It was the sound of an entire worldview beginning to fracture. Every meal served in a steaming enamel bowl, every small luxury chipped away at the foundation of their beliefs. But the fences weren't just there to keep the prisoners in. They also served to keep the outside world out. And inside those barbed wire enclosures, old ideologies didn't just vanish. They festered. While most men wrestled with the bewildering kindness of their captors, a hardened minority saw it as a sign of weakness. They weren't interested in adapting. They were interested in control. And in the tight, claustrophobic world of the barracks, they were determined to enforce their own brutal brand of order, policing the thoughts and actions of their fellow prisoners. The real battle for many was only just beginning. Thank you for watching. If you found this glimpse into a lesser-known part of history interesting, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. See you next time. The day began before the sun, with the sharp blast of a bugle, reveille. Men tumbled out of their bunks, the familiar routine a strange comfort so far from home. Roll call in the pre-dawn chill, names echoing in German accents across an American field. Then, the trucks would arrive. They rumbled out to the orchards of Washington, the timber camps of Wisconsin, the vast sugar beet fields of Colorado. They worked in canneries in Indiana, their field gray uniforms a stark contrast against the bounty of the American heartland. This was the home front, short on able-bodied men, finding an unlikely and often unwelcome workforce in its captured enemies. For the prisoners, this labor wasn't just about passing the time. It was currency. Each day of sweat earned them coupons, scrip printed by the camp authorities. This was their new economy, a system where hard work translated into small, precious choices. A few coupons could buy stationery to write a carefully worded letter home. A letter that might take months to arrive, if it ever did. More coupons could buy a piece of candy, a fleeting taste of sweetness in a world of bland routine. And for some, it meant continuing that uniquely American ritual, a 5-cent bottle of Coca Cola, a symbol of the very culture they had been sent to fight. But life behind the wire wasn't just work and waiting. In the quiet hours, a different world took shape. Camps established libraries, stocked with books in both German and English. Captured professors and schoolmasters, now just prisoners in uniform, held classes for their younger comrades, teaching everything from mathematics to literature. Soccer leagues sprung up, the familiar European game played with fierce passion on dusty American pitches. And then there were the baffled, often comical, Afternoons spent trying to understand baseball. A game of strange rules and even stranger terminology, explained by guards who found the whole situation surreal. It was in these moments that the enemy became simply men. Yet steel was never far from the sweetness. Among the prisoners were the hardliners, the true believers, committed to the Nazi ideology even in defeat. They saw the camp's relative comforts not as humane treatment, but as an American weakness to be exploited. They became a shadow authority within the wire. Whispers turned to threats in the darkness of the barracks. Men suspected of being anti-Nazi or too friendly with the Americans were intimidated, their loyalty questioned, their safety compromised. This wasn't just a holding pen. It was a battleground for belief, a struggle for the soul of the German soldier. And then, the whispers became a scream. In November 1943, at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, the hidden war broke into the open. A German corporal, Johannes Kunz, was suspected by his fellow prisoners of being an informant. He was beaten to death in a kangaroo court, held by a small group of Nazi fanatics. The illusion of peaceful internment was shattered. The U.S. military responded swiftly and severely. The perpetrators were identified, tried by an American court-martial, and found guilty of murder. 5 of them were hanged at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The message was brutal and clear. American order had teeth. The quiet routine of the camps was a fragile piece masking a vicious ideological conflict that had followed these men across an ocean, a war fought not with tanks and planes but with fear and conviction in the heart of the... Hello again. With the war in Europe winding down, another battle was just beginning inside America's POW camps. This was a war for the mind, a quiet, persistent campaign to reshape the beliefs of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. The U.S. Army's Special Projects Division launched an ambitious re-education program, hoping to plant the seeds of democracy in soil hardened by years of propaganda. The weapons in this war weren't guns, but words. German-language newspapers, like Der Ruf, The Call, began circulating through the barracks. These weren't crude propaganda leaflets. They were sophisticated publications edited by German intellectuals and writers who had fled the Nazi regime. They offered news from the outside world, articles on democratic principles, and literature that had been banned back home. Suddenly, men who had only known one narrative were exposed to a dizzying array of new ideas. Lectures became a common sight. Exiled German professors, once silenced, now stood before their countrymen, explaining concepts like free elections, individual rights, and the rule of law. They screened films, not just Hollywood fantasies, but stark documentaries contrasting the promises of the Third Reich with the utter ruin it had brought upon Germany. The prisoners' reactions were a mix of everything you'd expect. Many scoffed, dismissing it as enemy propaganda. Others were openly hostile, their loyalty to the homeland unshaken. But for some, a flicker of curiosity was ignited. You could hear it in the barracks at night, men tentatively testing out new words, arguing about what freedom, or justice, really meant. They were wrestling with the cognitive dissonance of it all. This psychological battle was fought against a backdrop of deep personal turmoil. Letters from home arrived, their pages filled with stories of hunger, cold, and uncertainty. A prisoner might read about his family struggling to find a single potato while he sat in a mess hall, sipping coffee with sugar, a simple luxury that now felt like a betrayal. The guilt was a heavy, constant companion. A quiet knowing that made the abstract arguments about political systems feel both distant and intensely personal. How could they reconcile their relative comfort with the suffering of their loved ones? The easy certainties of the battlefield were gone, replaced by a complex and agonizing moral landscape. And then there were the contradictions the prisoners saw with their own eyes. In some camps, particularly in the Jim Crow South, a bizarre and unsettling reality emerged. A German prisoner of war, still wearing his field gray uniform, could walk into a local diner and be served a meal at the counter. But an African-American soldier, wearing the uniform of the U.S. Army, would be denied that same service. The prisoners noticed. They talked about it. Here was America, preaching about liberty and equality, while practicing a rigid system of racial segregation. This wasn't lost on them. It was a visible flaw, a bruise on the very ideals the re-education program was trying to sell. It gave the skeptics ammunition and complicated the narrative of American mercy. Despite the relative comfort, the yearning for home and freedom was a powerful force. The most famous escape attempt wasn't a tale of daring triumph, but one of almost comical absurdity. In December 1944, at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, a group of German naval officers, including a U-boat ace, dug a 178-foot tunnel out of the camp. They imagined that they could build a raft and sail down the Salt River to Mexico. But when they emerged into the desert night, they discovered a harsh reality. The Salt River was bone dry. The canals they found flowed the wrong way. One escapee, hoping to blend in, approached a railroad worker and asked for a match in heavily accented English, only to be politely asked if he was one of the escaped Germans. Most were recaptured within days, not with violence, but with a sense of weary resignation. So the war ended, but the arguments continued. The barbed wire fences held men's bodies, but they could no longer contain their thoughts. A new, uncertain world was dawning, and behind the wire, these men were left to grapple with it, arguing softly in two languages, one of their past and one of a possible, complicated future. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. We'll see you next time. The seasons turned, and the gravel paths hardened with the first frost of winter. Inside the wire, something strange and beautiful began to happen. Christmas carols, once sung in hushed, separate corners, started to braid together. A German still knot would drift across the compound, only to be answered by an American silent night from the guard towers. It was a fragile harmony, a temporary truce declared in song. The generosity of spirit didn't stop there. On holidays, tubs of ice cream would appear, a sweet, cold shock in the middle of winter. Someone, somewhere up the chain of command, had decided that kindness was a tool, not a weakness. This wasn't just about food. It was about acknowledging a shared humanity. In Algona, Iowa, the townspeople gathered to admire a nativity scene, hand-carved with meticulous care by the German prisoners. Each figure, from the wise men to the humble shepherds, was a testament to shared faith and enduring skill. It was a bridge built of wood and artistry. Out on the fields, a soccer ball would occasionally sail over the fence, landing among the American guards. A few minutes later, it would be tossed back, maybe a little more scuffed, a little more worn, a silent exchange in a game that transcended uniforms. These small moments of contact, of craftsmanship and play, chipped away at the wall of animosity, revealing the men on either side. But this fragile peace was not universal. It existed in the shadow of a darker reality. In Salina, Utah, in the dead of night, the unthinkable happened. A guard, his judgment clouded by alcohol and prejudice, opened fire on a tent of sleeping German prisoners. 9 men died. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the entire POW system. It was a brutal reminder that hatred could still erupt with deadly force. The incident led to a court-martial, to grief and outrage. But it became the exception that haunted the rule, a stark counterpoint to the quiet acts of decency happening elsewhere. It proved that the line between humanity and barbarism was perilously thin, even here, far from the front lines. Then came the news, VE Day, the war in Europe was over. But inside the camps, there was no sudden jubilation, no gates swinging open. The end of the war was an anticlimax, a slow, bureaucratic unwinding. The world outside was celebrating, but for the men behind the wire, the waiting simply changed its name. Many were transferred, not home but to Britain and France, their labor now needed for reconstruction. Back in America, sugar rationing tightened for civilians, yet somehow, the red Coca Cola trucks kept rolling up to the camp gates. This strange paradox hung in the air. What kind of power was this? To defeat an enemy, then feed them, teach them, even offer them a cold bottle of soda on a hot day. It wasn't about dominance in the traditional sense. It was something more complex, something that defied easy definition. Finally, the real departure began. Ships started assembling in the ports, their massive hulls promising a journey home. The men packed their few belongings, letters, worn-out books, and PX coupons they'd saved. Small paper tokens of their time in America. They packed memories, too, of the bitter cold and the unexpected ice cream, of the hand-carved nativity and the scuffed soccer ball, of the shared carols and the long, quiet nights. They stood on the edge, poised between a past they were forced into and a future they couldn't yet imagine. They were leaving the physical fences behind, but they were taking the questions with them. What had this all meant? They were about to go home and spend the rest of their lives trying to figure it out. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. The journey home was a reversal of the one that brought them. The train cars, once filled with the nervous energy of capture, now held a different kind of tension, the quiet anticipation of return. For the German prisoners of war, America was receding, but its memory was now etched into them. The smell of the ship's hold, a mixture of rope and iron, was the first sensory link back to the old world. Then, landfall. Germany. But not the Germany they had left. The streets were shattered, the faces gaunt. The vibrant nation they had fought for was a ghost haunting its own ruins. For many, the return wasn't immediate. Tens of thousands were transferred to Britain and France. Their labor needed to clear rubble and rebuild what their own war machine had destroyed. They spent months, sometimes years, in these strange new captivities, trading American fields for European ruins. But eventually, the gates opened for good. They shed their uniforms and melted back into civilian life, becoming bakers, mechanics, and teachers once more. Yet America lingered. It lived on in small, strange talismans. A man might keep an empty Coca Cola bottle on his mantelpiece, a bizarre relic from a faraway land. He'd look at it and the taste would come flooding back, a sweet, fizzy shock that was now impossibly intertwined with the memory of a sun-drenched baseball game in Kansas. The murmur of a classroom where he learned English, or the simple, miraculous hum of an ice chest full of cold drinks on a hot day. These weren't just memories of imprisonment. They were memories of a different kind of order, a different kind of life. This personal recollection mirrored a larger post-war current. The return of Coca Cola to Germany was astonishingly swift. It was a symbol, not of occupation, but of a certain kind of normalcy and prosperity. It's a fascinating twist of history that the Fanta we know today was actually born in wartime Germany, a substitute created when Coke syrup couldn't get through the blockade. The war ended, and its American parent company simply reabsorbed its German child. The power of this global brand was measured not just in marketing, but in logistics, refrigeration, and a consistent product that tasted the same in Georgia as it did soon enough in Berlin. A few former prisoners were so taken with the American way of life that they later emigrated to the United States, choosing to build their future in the land where they were once held captive. Of course, we must name the ledger honestly. This story is not a simple fairy tale. There was the brutal murder of a German soldier at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, a horrific act of violence by a handful of Nazi fanatics against one of their own. There was the tragic Salina massacre, where a disturbed American guard opened fire on a tent of sleeping prisoners. And there was the constant, stinging contradiction of Jim Crow. Black soldiers guarded white prisoners who were often treated better than the guards themselves, allowed into restaurants and theaters that were forbidden to the very men who kept them behind wire. These are the deep, painful hypocrisies at the heart of the American experiment, contradictions that cannot and should not be erased. But they also don't erase the larger pattern. The American POW program was, for the most part, a story of disciplined mercy. It was an exercise in adherence to rules, even under the immense pressure of a world war. It demonstrated that power isn't just measured in tanks and bombers, but in the ability to maintain a system of order and fairness. In the end, ice cream and Coca Cola didn't win the war. That victory was bought with immense sacrifice on the battlefield. But these simple pleasures, these tokens of a consumer society, did help write the peace. They were emissaries of a different kind of power. They taught a subtle but profound lesson to hundreds of thousands of men. That order can be persuasive, that generosity can be a strategic asset, and that consistency, whether in a legal